Secret negotiations between Vladimir Putin and the director of the United States Central Intelligence Agency took place today in Moscow against the backdrop of intelligence reports that Russia is preparing an attack on Europe and the mobilization of 500,000 Russians for this purpose. And also against the backdrop of the United States fearing that Iran, with the support of Russia and China, might launch a new military escalation in the Middle East. Imagine the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, urgently cancels a large-scale event in the Kremlin, which hundreds of people had been preparing for, and completely changes his work schedule. The reason is the unexpected visit of the director of the US Central Intelligence Agency, John Ratcliffe. And so, when the negotiations in Moscow ended, not only did a US military plane with CIA Director John Ratcliffe on board fly to Lithuania, but another one followed in the same direction. A plane from the Rossiya Special Flight Unit also took off, the one that usually transports high-ranking officials of the Russian Federation, which is very unusual. In addition, besides the CIA director, a representative of the Vatican also arrived in Moscow and joined the negotiations. And importantly, something like this has already happened once in recent history. In November 2021, 3 months before the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, another CIA director also flew to Moscow on a similar military plane. And now, on August 25, 2026, history almost literally repeats itself. An American military aircraft lands at Vnukovo. Putin changes his entire work schedule, and a few hours later the plane with CIA Director John Ratcliffe on board flies back. And right after that, a mysterious aircraft from the Rossiya Special Flight Unit takes off. And now the first insider reports have appeared about what exactly the CIA Director brought to Moscow. And how is this connected to the large-scale NATO military air exercises around Kaliningrad and US intelligence data that Russia is preparing a provocation against Europe? Let's calmly break everything down now, go through this whole story literally hour by hour with all the versions and of course historical words and parallels. My name is Alexey Pesci, let's discuss this topic together. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. And at the end of the episode, if you find this information important and necessary, I will ask you to support the work of this independent YouTube channel with your donation or a paid YouTube membership. All of this can be done through the links and details in the description of this video. But that's at the end of the episode. For now. So let's go through everything step by step and start with the very fact of the US military plane's visit to Moscow. CBS News correspondent Jennifer Jacobs, citing unnamed sources, was the first to report that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America, John Ratcliffe, arrived in Russia on Tuesday to participate in several meetings in Moscow. Reuters later confirmed this information. And in the Kremlin they pretended to be clueless and said they had no idea what was going on, and the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov even said he didn't know anything about it. A US military plane landed at Vnukovo. An American military transport plane, the Boeing C-17 Globemaster III of the United States Air Force, arrived in Moscow. This is the same aircraft whose route we already discussed in the previous episode. It took off from the United States of America on Sunday, first arrived in Riga, and on Tuesday flew directly from the capital of Latvia to Moscow. According to the Flight Radar 24 service, the plane landed at Vnukovo airport in the morning. After the arrival of the American aircraft, a motorcade with American diplomatic license plates was spotted in Moscow. The Kremlin's reaction was pointedly evasive and played out on several levels at once. The press secretary of the President of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, stated that the Kremlin does not have any information about the American military plane that arrived at Vnukovo. And he added that meetings with representatives of the White House supposedly were not planned for today. I want to emphasize again, and yet Russians continue to still believe Dmitry Peskov after all this. By the way, today he said that mobilization is definitely 100% not being planned. But here's what's interesting. The Kremlin pool correspondent Alexander Yunashev reported that Vladimir Putin urgently changed his Tuesday work schedule today against the backdrop of the visit by the head of the US Central Intelligence Agency. A large-scale event planned for that day, which hundreds of people had been preparing for, was postponed, literally just a few days before it was supposed to take place today. That is, as soon as the Kremlin found out that the CIA director was coming, they immediately cancelled everything. According to him, sources confirmed this information about the arrival in Moscow of John Ratcliffe, and it was precisely because of this visit that Vladimir Putin cancelled all plans for today. Another telling detail, something the US administration did even before Ratcliffe's visit to Moscow. According to Axios, Washington notified the Ukrainian side in advance about the upcoming visit of the high-level delegation and asked Kyiv to suspend strikes on Russia until their departure. The Financial Times clarifies that the request applied not only to Moscow, but also to St. Petersburg and the northern regions of Russia. In other words, to the entire route, the whole flight path of the US Air Force plane. According to Axios, the entire flight path of the US Air Force plane. They are clearly coordinating poses with Ukraine and notified the Ukrainian side in advance about the upcoming visit of a high-ranking delegation to Kyiv. Let me remind you that when the Americans asked not to strike Novorossiysk, this was not always followed. But why did CIA Director John Ratcliffe come to Moscow today? Here it's worth going through each version in detail, and let's start with the Wall Street Journal's analysis. According to intelligence data cited by the publication, Russian military conducted mobilization training exercises in the Kaliningrad region as well as in other regions, checking the Russian Ministry of Defense infrastructure for readiness to receive new recruits, provide them with food and weapons. Moreover, reports already imagined that the regions are allocating millions, even hundreds of millions of rubles specifically for preparing infrastructure for mobilization. And Armenia officially announced today that it is ready to accept Russians fleeing mobilization. And that's exactly why, due to the fact that in the Kaliningrad region Russia was testing the mobilization infrastructure, large-scale military air exercises were held around Kaliningrad by NATO the day before. I have a separate episode on this topic on this YouTube channel. In addition, American intelligence received information that Vladimir Putin might try to test the strength of the North Atlantic Alliance. Analysts believe that Ratcliffe might have delivered a warning to Vladimir Putin. Former US Deputy Director of National Intelligence Beth Sanner outlined the possibility. Цель визита так. The goal might have been to tell Putin, we know what you're planning and you'd better not do it. On the other hand, and this is also important to note, it could also have been related to the ceasefire in Iran and bringing someone else into the Middle East negotiations. Meanwhile, Ukrainian media are offering their own version. The purpose of Ratcliffe's visit could have been to discuss a mutual Russian-Ukrainian moratorium on strikes, as well as a ceasefire in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions as the first steps toward overall de-escalation. The British publication The II paper links John Ratcliffe's visit to a possible prisoner exchange, noting that a US military plane has already flown to Russia. In February 2025, when Vladimir Putin agreed to release 60-year-old schoolteacher Mark Fogel, who was convicted in Russia on drug smuggling charges. Earlier, with the involvement of the CIA, the Trump administration had already secured the release of Wall Street Journal journalist Evan Gershkovich and Marine Paul Whelan. And let me remind you, both of them were convicted in Russia on espionage charges. Separately, it is worth citing a detailed analysis. American journalist Michael Weiss, who specializes in Russian intelligence agencies, the GRU, disinformation, Ukraine and the Middle East, Let me remind you, he previously worked at CNN, now he collaborates with the Daily Beast and New Lions magazine. And he is also the director of special investigations at the Free Russia Foundation. So, his assessment is as follows, quote, "If I had to bet, I would say that Ratcliffe arrived in Moscow to warn about the consequences of a possible escalation by Russia against Europe and NATO. This is probably related to the American intelligence data that Washington shared with Poland, the Baltic countries and Scandinavia. Against the backdrop of a noticeable increase in alleged GRU sabotage operations and Russian drone activity in the region,
в Европе.
remember Germany, Bulgaria, Romania and other countries." End of quote. I would like to point out here that the Vice directly states that a third drone with explosives was found in Germany. And all these three drones are linked to an attempt by Russian intelligence services to attack a Ukrainian military transport aircraft which was at Leipzig airport in early August. And in Bulgaria, let me remind you, military factories were on fire. In Romania, Russian drones flew in for several nights in a row. In Italy, a military factory was also on fire. Well, overall, it's obvious that recently the Russians have been increasing their acts of sabotage all over Europe. In addition, Vice directly rejects the version about a prisoner exchange. Quote, "You don't need to send the CIA director himself to Moscow for a prisoner exchange. Besides, Ratcliffe is one of the most pro-Ukrainian officials in the Trump administration. He was responsible in particular for helping Kiev carry out long-range strikes." So, there's a hint here that Ratcliffe might have come to Moscow to warn Putin, like, listen, if you go for escalation, keep that in mind. I'm already helping Ukraine carry out long-range strikes on Russia. Well, then we'll give some more weapons to the Ukrainians and step up these attacks on the territory of the Russian Federation. And then Vice adds that very historical parallel, which is basically why we're discussing this topic now, to draw parallels with what's happening in general. He says the context is important here. In 2021, Bill Burns also went to Moscow to warn Putin about the invasion of Ukraine. According to Vice, the specific content of today's talks included discussions about mutually stopping strikes on the energy infrastructure and ports of Ukraine and Russia. A possible ceasefire in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions as steps toward overall de-escalation as well as prospects for ending the war as a whole. So this matches the insider information that is currently circulating in the Ukrainian media community. In parallel with the CIA visit, another significant event took place which further strengthens the entire diplomatic picture of today. For the first time in 5 years, a representative of the Vatican arrived in Russia. The Vatican representative called for an end to the savage Russian war against Ukraine. Archbishop Paul Gallagher held a meeting with the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, where they discussed ways to achieve peace in Ukraine and agreed to cooperate on humanitarian issues. Let me remind you, earlier in the previous episode, just yesterday, we were just discussing with you that it might be possible. The representative of the Vatican, Gallagher, brought to Moscow a peace plan that was developed by Ukraine, Europe and the USA. And it was exactly this plan that might have been discussed at this meeting with Lavrov. So, we talked about it yesterday, I already mentioned this version to you yesterday, and today it has been confirmed. And this echoes what we already discussed in the previous episode about Volodymyr Zelensky's plan with a ceasefire and a buffer zone, which they planned to hand over to Lavrov. Specifically through the Vatican mediator. Today we also have a leak from a source close to Ukrainian intelligence, in particular the Ukrainian agency Ukraine Context writes. The Ukrainian side is aware of certain aspects and issues that were discussed in Moscow during close negotiations over several, not very lengthy conversations between the American side and Russian officials. This is about an important operation, the preparation for which had been carried out in secrecy for some time. Its results may have significant implications for future developments. In general, I'm just assuming this isn't insider information, I assume that Ratcliffe really did warn Putin, saying, "Listen, if you escalate the war against Europe now, then we are definitely ready to take the gloves off in Ukraine, to provide more weapons and to strike even more and more massively against the unwashed Russians. Like these strikes on Wildberries warehouses, on oil refineries will seem like nothing compared to what's coming." The outcome of this whole story was just as unexpected and adds even more mystery. Ratcliffe's plane left Vnukovo airport in Moscow at around 1850 Moscow time and headed toward Latvia along the same route it had arrived. And right after that, according to Flight Radar 24, a plane from the Rossiya Special Flight Detachment took off. This is the very same one that's used to transport the highest officials of the Russian Federation. Later it disappeared from the radar. Where exactly it went and who was on board has not been publicly disclosed, but there's a possibility that they also flew in the same direction. And to complete the picture, it's worth recalling the historical precedent from 2021. Back then, in November 2021, US President Joe Biden sent CIA Director William Burns to Moscow. He led a delegation of high-ranking American officials. On November 2nd and 3rd, 2021, Burns met with the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and the Director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Naryshkin, and also spoke personally with Vladimir Putin himself. One of the key goals of that visit was to convey the serious concern of the United States about the concentration of Russian troops near the borders of Ukraine and to try to clarify Moscow's intentions. Burns later recalled. At that time, the CIA had exceptional intelligence revealing Putin's plans to invade Ukraine. This information, combined with his own years-long personal acquaintance with the Russian leader, convinced him of the seriousness of Russia's intentions. Joe Biden sent Burns to Moscow specifically to warn the bold dictator Vladimir Putin by directly laying out the exact details of what the United States knew. According to Burns, Putin's reaction was, quote, completely unapologetic. Well, what it means is that he wasn't worried about it at all and was definitely planning to attack. What happened next is telling. It was Burns himself who personally delivered the warning about the impending Russian invasion not only to high-ranking American officials but also to European allies, but also personally to the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who at that time was skeptical that Vladimir Putin would actually decide to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. A month before the start of the full-scale war, Burns informed Zelensky that Russia intended to launch a lightning strike against Kiev and decapitate the central government. Putin's goal failed at that time, partly thanks to the advance warning about Russian plans provided by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Later, in the midst of the war, Burns made regular secret trips to Kiev to brief Zelensky. Ukrainian officials considered him a respected figure. Precisely because his accurate warning in January 2022 that Russian forces would try to seize the Antonov airport helped Ukraine prepare to defend the airport and prevent Russia from gaining a foothold there to take Kiev. There is also another very important detail for the full picture. Since his appointment in January 2025, Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, maintained regular contact with his Russian counterpart, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Naryshkin. And so, in the end, the United States warns European countries that Putin is preparing a mobilization and getting ready to attack NATO, and the head of American intelligence personally flew to Moscow. But there is also a second part of the story that should not be overlooked. This is the Middle East. Personally, this version doesn't seem viable to me, but nevertheless I'll mention it as well so you keep it in mind. The United States may be warning Moscow that it will have to break off relations with Tehran as part of a new economic phase of the war with the US. Otherwise, Russia will face secondary sanctions, and even more so, the US is dissuading the Kremlin from transferring weapons to Iran. But this version pales in comparison to the threats from Russia to attack NATO countries and warnings from American intelligence that Putin is ready to start an even larger scale war. I'll leave it at that. Be sure to write your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this video. Friends, if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or by becoming a sponsor on the YouTube platform. You can do all of this using the links and details in the description of this video. There are different options, so choose whichever is most convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support you provide. Subscribe to the channel, give it a like and hit the bell icon. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.